The CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code was developed to help property developers increase the energy efficiency and the upgradability of their building projects. Energy savings help offset the potential higher cost of building your home to code. And enhanced upgradability helps commercial owners increase their competitive advantage, saving money over time. Additionally, lower energy demands during and after the building process can also lead to community and national level benefits like reduced reliance on fossil fuel generated electricity across the construction industry and in homes, lower national fuel import bills, which can free up funding for other critical areas of investment, and fewer greenhouse gas emissions. So do the maths, play the long game, and help build towards a better future today. For more information on the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code, visit energy.crosq.org.
Mr. Derek Omar, CEO of CROSQ, Mr. Elson Jordan, Finance Manager of CREE, representatives of the CARICOM Energy Unit and CREE, directors and colleagues within the CROSQ network, directors of bureaus and colleagues within the CROSQ network, heads of organizations, heads of private sector agencies and businesses, media personnel present, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Let me welcome you to the fifth of a 10-part series of webinars under the TAPSEC project. This morning's webinar is the first in a 3-part town hall meetings, which is intended to provide you with in-depth details of the requirements and implications of the Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code. At this point in time, I would like to invite the CEO of CROSQ, Mr. Derek Omar, to address you and welcome you officially. Mr. Omar.
Thanks very much, Mr. Sempri. Mr. Elson Jordan, Finance Manager, Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, and colleagues, representatives of the GIZ and TAPSEC project, representatives of the CARICOM Energy Unit, CROSQ directors and colleagues of the 15 Bureaus of Standards of CARICOM, Mr. Fulgent Sempri, Technical Officer, CROSQ Secretariat, and colleagues, Mr. Churchill Norbert, Featured Speaker and Head of the Regional Project Team for the development of the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code, hereafter referred to as REBEC, Mr. Ryan Cobbs of Belize, Mr. Stanley Smelly of Jamaica, Mr. Jonathan Platt of Barbados, and Ms. Nadita Ramachala of Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you for being panelists. Media representatives, ladies and gentlemen. The CARICOM Regional Organization for Standards and Quality would like to wish you a good morning and a warm welcome to its webinar series, REBEC in a Snapshot. In this 3-part webinar series over the next 3 days, we will focus on the 2018 CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code, or the REBEC, and its requirements for residential and commercial use, including all the ASHRAE compliance peripheral standards. The 2018 REBEC was prioritized and developed by CROSQ in response to a direct mandate from a special meeting of the CARICOM Ministers of Energy held in Trinidad and Tobago. Specifically, the code was to be used as one of several mechanisms to increase energy efficiency and reduce energy consumption in member states. It was anticipated that once implemented, the code would result in direct reduction in consumption of energy in buildings. In developing the REBEC, a number of prior regional research studies were used, such as the regional map, the roadmap for energy efficiency use in buildings, the development, implementation, and enforcement of regulation and codes within CARICOM member states, development of minimum energy performance standards for public and commercial buildings in CARICOM member countries, and finally, the status review and recommendations of a draft energy efficiency building code for CARICOM. The base code for the document, in addition to this regional research, is the International Energy Conservation Code, ICC, of the International Code Council, and which inherently includes reference to ASHRAE standards. The 2018 Council of Ministers approved REBEC was jointly published by the International Code Council of the USA and enjoys international status, a first for our region. We are therefore well pleased that a number of member states are currently in the process of adopting the code at the national level, the most recent being Antigua and Barbuda, which, after a 3-year process, declared the code as a national standard earlier this month. According to the publication, Energy Efficiency 2018, Analysis and Outlook to 2040, the International Energy Agency said that buildings and appliances were responsible for about 30% of global final energy use, and that the 2 fastest growing end users in buildings are space, cooling, and appliances. It is therefore important for member states within CARICOM and the region in general to develop and introduce policy measures and legislation, such as this building code, to address energy conservation in buildings, including the use of appliances. Concepts such as cooling, shading, and minimizing incidents of mold due to well-conditioned buildings, among others, have to be utilized to facilitate net zero buildings and to reduce energy consumption in this area. This is important to both new buildings and the retrofitting of existing buildings. Thus, the value of the 2018 REBEC is that it addresses all these areas and more in a very comprehensive and integrated manner that is specific and well suited to our Caribbean region. The desire of the region to utilize energy codes, along with other measures to increase energy efficiency and reduce energy consumption, translates directly to a reduction in the proportion of GDP and foreign exchange spent on the importation of fossil fuels for energy generation in the region. It would be remiss of me, however, to highlight the importance of codes only from the perspective of reduction of imports of fossil fuels into the region, without making a link between the reduction of the consumption of fossil energies, and carbon emissions, and the impact on climate change. Climate change, as we know it, is caused by the emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, brought about from the consumption of fossil fuels, for example, coal, oil, and gas, among other things. This phenomenon has necessitated a commitment to the international agreements by the global economy, and which includes each of our 15 CARICOM member states, to keep global temperatures to below 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels. As a region and at the national level, this can be achieved through reduction in energy consumption, facilitated by the uptake and introduction of clean energy sources and renewable energy technologies, as well as through increased energy efficiency measures and policies in vehicles, equipment, appliances, and buildings. In 2018, the REBEC, along with other measures, is therefore critical in climate change mitigation. When utilized along with a comprehensive suite of building codes, which almost every CARICOM country has, the REBEC can also serve to build resilience and adaptation to the severe weather patterns and the increased intensity brought about by climate changes, such as increased heat and hurricanes. Without a doubt, therefore, utilization of the REBEC is vital to the region's sustainability. So what has CROSSQ done to advance the uptake of the REBEC since its publication in 2018? Well, we have sought to build capacity in the 15 member states of CARICOM through the training delivered to industry practitioners on the code compliance and certification training to code officials and code inspectors. Through other projects, we have also helped to develop the energy efficiency testing capabilities of appliances in 2 energy efficiency laboratories in Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards. We are also now furthering this cause by sensitizing and building awareness in collaboration with CREE through our webinars and animation on the benefits of the codes, such as this webinar seems to address. In conclusion, we see the 2018 REBEC, if utilized and implemented at the national level, achieving a reduction in the consumption of energy in buildings, as well as a reduction in fossil fuel imports, and serving as a measure both in mitigating and adapting to climate change. Importantly, we see utility benefits and also direct monetary savings to individual stakeholders such as homeowners, business owners, construction and industry practitioners, code officials, inspectors, and policymakers. So we urge you to learn about this 2018 REBEC, or this CARICOM Energy Efficiency Building Code, and its requirements. Embrace the improvements that it can bring about in climate change, GDP, foreign exchange savings, fossil fuel replacement, and so forth, and utilize the code for the advancements of your interests and the sustainability of our region. We thank you for joining us over the next 3 days as we seek to expand the utilization of the REBEC in this snapshot series of webinars, and we look forward to your robust discussions. Thank you once again for taking this time and effort to be with us.
Thank you, Mr. Omar. Thanks for setting the context, giving us the background to the development of the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code. You did indicate in your address that the code is based on an international code, the first in the region. And let me indicate that we would have adapted the International Energy Conservation Code, which is a publication of the International Code Council, ICC, created a Caribbean application document and incorporated it into the publication of the code. Thanks once again, Mr. Omar, for these insightful words. At this time, I would like to invite the finance manager, Mr. Elson Jordan, right, to bring us greetings and welcome remarks from the CARICOM Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency. Mr. Jordan, the floor is yours.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Certainly, it's a pleasure of mine to be here on behalf of the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, the CREE. Our protocols having been established, I'm pleased to welcome you.
Your video, Mr. Jordan.
Sorry. Better? Good. So yes, I'm pleased to welcome each of you this morning to the commencement of a 3-day series of webinars focusing on the Caribbean Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code, the CREEBC. We are elated that you have been taking the time to learn more about how the Quebec can assist you in building efficiently, and that as you build and rebuild, you also calculate that the home that emerges from your house is connected to a wider ecosystem, and we need to understand the performance of those interfaces and the impact of the outputs from your connections on the ecosystem. That this will be and needs to be underscored again over the next 3 days is integral and important as the region moves forward with a much integrated component of the Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Trust. I wish to acknowledge the great work being done in this area by a number of key resources and panel to help us to better understand uh, new and developing ideas, trends, challenges, and yes, some new and innovative solutions as we navigate through this interesting imperative that engages us in and as a region. Speakers and moderators over the next 3 days who will be in engagement with you includes Mr. Churchill Norbert, Managing Director, Energy and Engineering Consultancy Services, Mr. Ryan Cobb, Energy Director, the Ministry of Public Service, Energy and Public Utilities in Belize, Mr. Stanley Smelly, the Energy Engineer with the University of the West Indies Mono Campus, Mr. Jonathan Platt, Technical Officer, Engineering and Building Components of the Barbados National Standards Institution, the technical officers and staff of the Cross-School Secretariat, and the region's national bureaus of standards, in addition to my other colleagues at the CARICOM Secretariat, our development partners, and of course, my colleagues at the CREE. As I reflect again, I'm reminded that I am tasked with welcoming you to these town halls, Quebec in a snapshot. And so I ask myself, well, to what am I welcoming you to? I would like to welcome you to come inside the conversation, come inside the purpose of the conversation, come inside and come onto the right side of history, come inside a future whose history beckons us to be good stewards of our destiny, and come inside the better angels of ourselves. The Caribbean Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code has been subject of much technical designs and development, tests and stress tests, robust discussion on its applicability, its cost to implement, etc., etc. I wish to refer you again to the 5 Ps of the agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals. 1, people. The code stands to benefit the people of the region by reducing the cost of electricity generation. 2, our planet. For example, greenhouse gas emissions will be reduced with the reduction in the use of fossil fuels to produce electricity and lessen the impact on the planet. 3, prosperity. At least 95% of the Caribbean's electricity generation comes through imported fossil fuels. Reduction of these costs can increase global competitiveness, especially in commerce and manufacturing. That is taken from the Quebec Code of 2018. 4, peace. Joint efforts to implement goals that contribute to sustainability can bring varied stakeholders with varying interests together to work towards common goals. 5, partnerships. Efforts to implement the Quebec must be a partnership of all countries and all relevant organizations and stakeholders if the sustainability of the region is to be achieved. Again, people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. And so today, this important conversation continues. What has lied though has not been the conversation, but the conversion. And so today and tomorrow and Thursday, that engagement continues. And truly, we value all soldiers of the cause. We hope that this conversation will bring you to advance further along the journey, and that as you walk and talk, yours will be one of understanding the conversation, and yes, and then one of application, the conversion. I trust that the webinars, as they unfold over the next 3 days, will be most useful for you as you seek to restore, renovate, and rebuild. I leave you in the capable hands of my colleagues this morning, tomorrow, and Thursday. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan, Finance Manager, CREE. And it's a pleasure for CrossQ really to be partnering with you all on this important initiative. In the two addresses so far, you would have heard that it was an adaptation of the International Energy Conservation Code. Mr. Omar and Mr. Jordan would have mentioned some names, and the persons they would have mentioned is giving recognition to those experts who would have sat on the technical committee reviewing the International Energy Conservation Code and seeking to adapt it accordingly. So those individuals, I'd like to say thank you. You would be seeing more of them once you join our other webinars slated for tomorrow and Thursday. At this point in time, I would like to invite you to do a short poll, just about 2 minutes. The questions will be placed on the screen. Very simple questions. Just take 2 minutes off to do that poll for us. We have 3 questions. Thank you very much for taking time off to fill up the poll for us. At this point in time, I would like to, this is the results of the poll as seen, your responses, right? Have you heard about the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Billing Code before this webinar? 78% of you all responded yes, and 21% would have said no. And I'm hoping as a result of this webinar, you're more informed, and you could also go back to your respective constituents or constituencies and spread the word even more. Where did you hear about the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code? Social media, 11%. The National Standards Body, 48%. Ministry of Energy, 11%. Never before, 5%, and other places, 40%, right? It's good to see that our national standards bodies are the leading agency where you would source of information that you got about the code. And does your country have a building or energy code? And 57% of you responded yes, 24% said no, and 19% say they don't know. Okay, these are things that you need to know. I'd like just to encourage you to continue engaging the various agencies responsible for code development and code implementation. All right. Before I go ahead and introduce my presenter, just want to highlight a few things. So please use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen to type questions and comments for the speaker to address, to be brought to my attention. We encourage engagement against yours, utilizing the function during the session. Short polls, as we would have indicated earlier, we carried a poll. We will do a second poll towards the end of the presentation of Mr. Norbert. And the webinar is being recorded, right? And streamed live on Facebook, on our YouTube channel. So if someone has not connected, please inform them that they could tune into YouTube for the proceedings going on there. Now, we will have spoken about our presenter. Our presenter this morning is Mr. Zephanias Norbert. Mr. Norbert is an engineer whose areas of specialty are electrical engineering, energy management, renewable energy, and project management. He has worked in the energy industry for over 3 decades in the CARICOM region and internationally. Mr. Norbert is the founder of and managing director, of Energy and Energizing Consulting Services based in Antigua. He holds a 3-year diploma in electrical engineering power from the University of Technology in Jamaica. He's also a certified engineer, energy manager. He's certified photovoltaic practitioner designation and a certified hospitality facilities manager. He have an executive and a Master of Science degree in project management from the University of Stanford. Mr. Norbert also is an active member of the Association of Energy Engineers based in the USA. He is the chairman of the National Electrotechnical Committee in Antigua and Barbuda and reports and represents Antigua and Barbuda on ISO Technical Committee 301. He was the chairman of the regional project team that developed the 2018 CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Billing Code. Mr. Norbert is an adjunct lecturer at the University of the West Indies. Adjunct lecturer at the University of the West Indies, Open Campus in Antigua and Barbuda. He is married with 2 children and is an Antigua by nationality, although born a St. Lucian national. Mr. Norbert is well experienced, as he would have indicated, that he was the principal driver of the project team in the development of the code. So right now, I'd like to invite Mr. Norbert to make his presentation. Just one housekeeping factor. He would like you to engage him at various points. He would indicate where questions would be entertained. So During this presentation, you note your questions, you could put it in the chat, or you'll be getting an opportunity to ask it directly, right? Maybe after the first 20 slides, he would invite you to request questions from you all, but during his presentation, you could put questions in the chat so he could engage you at a specific time. Mr. Norbert, please proceed.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Fulgence. And a special welcome to every single one of you. I see we have 90 participants. So welcome to this webinar series. And you would have heard the background and the introduction, the welcome remarks from Mr. Omar, and as well from Mr. Jordan. So for some of you, this is familiar in terms of the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code, because we would have gone through some training before. For some of you, you have had a first-hand experience because you were part of the development of this CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code. And so we had, during the development process, we went through every single member state. There was strong representation by the 15 member states of CARICOM, and the inputs that led to the development of this CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code did not leave any country behind. So this code belongs to us. It was developed by us, and it is something that we all must embrace and take ownership of because it belongs to us. So once again, I want to say thanks to all of the members who were part of the project team that went through the development of the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code. So going forward, I will refer to the code as the CREEBC. As you could see, our discussion today will go through the CREEBC in a snapshot. My emphasis will be on residential requirements. So the topics we'll be discussing this morning will include the definition of a residential building. What is a residential building? And as you seek to utilize the code and implement the code in your respective jurisdictions, it's important to understand the definition. What is a residential building? And this will be the focus of my presentation here today. Then we'll look at the compliance options. This is the first step when it comes to utilizing the code. Being able to identify the compliance option that your project team would decide to use throughout the use of the code. And each compliance option will have its own requirements. Now, if a member state, if you were to adopt the code as a national code, then of course you would include the documentation, the code officials, whether it's the building department or the other code officials in your respective jurisdiction. And if you have adopted the code as a national standard, as we did in Antigua and Barbuda, and then so you will go through a voluntary process, which will not include the code officials. So we'll discuss at length the compliance options, because this code is supposed to be part of your design discussions as you seek to construct your new buildings or do any renovations in an existing building. Topic 3 will cover the whole concept of the building thermal envelope requirements. Very important aspect in terms of energy efficiency in buildings. So we'll discuss at length what is the thermal envelope, what are the requirements for the thermal envelope for residential buildings. We'll be looking at the lighting system requirements for residential buildings. And for those of you who may be familiar with some of the new products on the market today, like LED lights, high efficacy lamps, the code provides an opportunity for you to utilize the technologies that are available, control systems as well for lighting. Then mechanical system requirements. Now, when you hear of the mechanical system requirements, we speak about the cooling systems, the ventilating systems, so ventilation fans, for example, would include the insulation as far as the distribution pipes for hot water systems, the efficiencies of the air conditioning units, the ventilation aspect of buildings. And that's very, very, very important as far as the safety of the occupants of buildings. We are aware of the fact that we spend most of our active life in a building. So approximately 90% of our daily encounters are within buildings. And then finally, we will discuss existing building implications. So if you have an existing building, what would be the requirements if you were doing a project, a renovation project in an existing building? So as we go through the presentation, I want you to think about the opportunities that are there to reduce wastage in buildings. And this is what the code is seeking to do, to allow you to use energy in a more effective way, to get the same work done or more work done with less energy. So the definition of a residential building, as per the CREEBC, includes detached 1 and 2 family dwellings. It also includes townhouses, as well as group R2, R3, and R4 buildings that are 3 stories or less in height above the grade plane. The pictures on the right pretty much would capture what I just said. So buildings that are 3 stories or less. This one is a single story. This is a 3-story building. And as well, the occupancy type, the residential type of occupancy, group R2, R3, and R4. So they typically are more permanent types of occupancy in which the occupants are within a dwelling space. So you have to look at the 3 stories or less, and as well the type of occupancy in the definition of a residential building. Now, as you seek to implement the code for your residential project, whether it's a new or an existing building, then the first step would be to consider, as I said before, the compliance option. And so if you are looking to utilize the code for your residential building, you first will examine the options as far as how you would demonstrate that your project is in compliance with the code. And so the first one we will be talking about is what we refer to as the simplified semi-conditioned compliance path. Let's go a little bit more in depth in terms of what this compliance path entails in terms of your design, the design of your residential building, and what you should consider if you were to select the simplified semi-conditioned compliance path. And you're also reminded that when codes are being utilized, it's always good to find the suitable compliance option, because there are many options to demonstrate the flexibility of the code, of which the CREEBC is flexible because it offers you many options to demonstrate compliance. So in this slide, we see here that we have what is known as the simplified table 1 checklist. And I will go through the requirements as far as what you would need to look for or what you need to include in your design to demonstrate that you can use the simplified table 1 checklist to demonstrate compliance with the code. So let's go a little bit more in depth. Now, before I proceed, this really pertains to the different steps, the compliance options for residential buildings. And the first one we'll discuss is highlighted in green. So if you have adopted the code as a national code, then you would go through the process of submitting the construction documents to the code officials. The plans, the different requirements for insulation, the number of floors, calculations, everything will be submitted to the code officials, just like you would do if you were doing a new construction, submitting your construction documents to the building officials for review. So they would review the application and to provide you with a permit for construction. So once they have reviewed the application and they have realized that you have identified the compliance option and you have met the requirements based on the documentation that you submitted, then the code officials will issue a permit for construction. So during the process of construction, then the inspections would be carried out by the code officials to ensure that you are sticking within the construction information, the specifications that you submitted. For example, if you said that you'll be using the thermal resistance of your envelope would be R3, then the inspector would like to see that you're actually doing what you said during construction as per the documents that you've submitted. And on completion, then you receive a certificate of occupancy. But if you have adopted the code like Antigua and Barbuda and a few other Caribbean countries who have adopted the code as a national standard, we know standards are voluntary. And so the need for the review and the inspections would not be necessary because you have adopted it as a national standard. So let's go a little bit more in depth. What would be the criteria used? What are the requirements if you are going to be using the simplified semi-condition compliance path? So the 3 requirements are listed here. The first thing is that not more than 1/2 of the occupied space is air conditioned. So 50% or less of your residential building is air conditioned. The second one is the occupied space is not heated. And I think this is a checkbox that all of us in the CARICOM region, we can check this box because at the moment, none of our buildings are being heated. Maybe in the future, some countries that are further up north might have to consider heating their buildings. But for now, pretty much all countries throughout the CARICOM region should be able to check this box quite easily. And the third requirement, to use a simplified approach, because don't forget, as I said, you first have to decide the compliance path. So in this simplified semi-condition compliance path, the third requirement is that solar, wind, or other renewable energy source supplies not less than 90% of the energy for service water heating. So in code language, we refer to it as service water heating, but ordinarily you may refer to it as your water heaters. So renewable energy must supply at least 90% of the energy for your service water heating systems. If you can meet all of these 3 requirements, then by design, your project will be able to utilize the simplified semi-condition compliance path, which is what we think most residential buildings in the CARICOM region can use as their compliance, to demonstrate compliance with the code. And you will, as I go through the presentation, you will see why I'm thinking about at least 80% of our buildings, based on the design of our residential buildings in the region, at least 80% of them should be able to utilize this simplified approach. So as you seek to utilize the code and you select your compliance option, this will be based on the design. I will be referencing this floor plan. It's a typical floor plan for our buildings in the region, where you have, these are the bedrooms, bedroom 1, bedroom 2, and this is the master bedroom down here. You notice that they all have ceiling fans, okay? And as well, the air conditioning units are only for the bedrooms. So the 3 bedrooms is a 3-bedroom residential building with the ceiling fans, as I said. The remainder of the building is not air conditioned. So let's go back to the 3 requirements. Number 1, at least 50% of the building is air conditioning. 50% or less is air conditioned, check. The second thing is that the building is not heated, check. And the third requirement we went through is that solar, wind, or other form of renewable energy supplies at least 90% of the energy for your service water heating. So we will be referencing this floor plan for the various compliance options of our building. And then the air conditioning unit is a duct ductless air conditioning unit. So there are no ducts within the building. It's just the split unit or the wall unit that goes through the wall to supply the air conditioning to the building. So table 1, this is what the requirements are for table 1. And here you see the reference sections. So we're referencing the various sections, the residential sections of the code. And it calls for a certificate to be installed next to the electrical panel. And the certificate will have the energy efficiency measures that you have included in your design. So when the building is commissioned, the certificate would provide the energy efficiency measures that you have included in your design for future reference. So the building owner, the facility manager, can refer to that certificate for future references. Then, of course, we said air conditioning is not more than 50%. Yes. Number 2 speaks about the space not being heated. Yes. Water heater power is from a renewable energy source. Yes. And then we get to glaze fenestration. When we speak of fenestration, we are speaking about windows, doors as vertical fenestration. So windows and doors would be part of the vertical fenestration. And then we have the skylights. Some of our residential buildings may want to consider the use of skylights. So the values that are listed here are for example, fenestration new factor for fixed fenestration. We have requirements for operable fenestration or operable windows and doors, fixed windows and doors. And we also have the vertical fenestration entrance doors. The values are listed here. So what you would do to demonstrate to the code official that you are in compliance with the code, or if you're using it as a national standard to demonstrate that you are in compliance, you would ensure that the windows and doors meet the requirements here or are better than the requirements. And if they are better than the requirements, it simply means that your application is above code. When it comes to the solar heat gain coefficient, the solar heat gain coefficient considers 2 things. It considers the orientation. Is the window or door located on the south, east, or western side of the building? The 3 facades, south, east, and west, would be exposed to more sunlight. So the more stringent measures for the solar heat gain coefficient, as opposed to the northern facade. So most architects would use the northern facade to have like more natural light and include more fenestration on the northern facade of buildings. So this would be the requirements for skylights as well, the solar heat gain coefficient, and you follow this table to demonstrate compliance with the code. This is an example of what the certificate looks like. And as I said, it should be near the panel or the utility panel so that the building owner can reference the parameters that were included in your design. A little bit more about the glazing. What is the solar heat gain coefficient, or the SHGC? The solar heat gain coefficient is the most important performance characteristic of fenestration in hot climates like us in the Caribbean region. And the image on the right clearly explains that. So we are seeking to have a high performance window or fenestration that would reduce the amount of radiant heat coming into the building from the sun. The impact or the implications, if you were not to have a window that's a high performance window, the impact it would have on your cooling loads is that your air conditioning system would now have to work much harder to cool that space. And lots of studies have been done in the region, lots of case studies as well on buildings to demonstrate how much can be saved from having a high performance window where you're reducing the amount of sunlight, the radiant heat, into the building. The projection factor, this was also a requirement, and it is a term or a requirement as far as trying to provide more shading for the windows. So basically the formula is projection factor is A over B, in which the distance from the window to the edge of the overhang, and then B is the distance below the overhang to the bottom of the window sill. So the projection factor can also be calculated. The higher the projection factor is the higher the solar heat gain coefficient. Because you have more shading, then it requires a less efficient window. So these are terms you should be familiar with. The cantilever, some people use awnings, some use the cantilever to provide this projection factor to pretty much result in more shading to reduce the impact of the radiant heat through fenestration. So the solar heat gain coefficient, as I said, is based on the projection factor and the orientation. And this checklist is highlighting the requirements as listed in the code. These figures are directly from the code, so it helps you to see that as you go through the procurement of your windows and doors, then you are now finding out from the supplier whether or not the window or the fenestration in general is meeting the requirements of the code. So there must be new relationships developed as you seek to implement the code. You will be dialoguing with your stakeholders, including the suppliers. So fenestration air leakage, again, another critical component that the code seeks to address, because windows like jalousie windows are very leaky. And so the objective is to try to make the envelope as tight as possible, not only in terms of blocking off the penetrations to ensure that they're properly sealed, but you need to know what the air leakage, the specifications of your fenestration in terms of air leakage. And this is the requirement as per the code, that windows, sliding glass doors, and skylights, the requirement is 1.5 liters per second per square meter. That's equal to 0.35 CFM per square foot. The same thing for your exterior swinging glass doors. The requirement would be 2.6 liters per second per square meter. Now, the code uses the SI units as the preferred unit of measurement, and you will see in some cases the corresponding imperial units next to the requirements, as you can see here. Now, this is a typical label for fenestration, and this label is from the National Fenestration Rating Institute in the US, where they would now give you the different parameters, whether it's the U factor, the solar heat gain coefficient, the visible transmittance, and the air leakage. This is new to us. Many times you would purchase windows or doors, we would just look at the design. But to be more efficient, it is to now know what the performance of the fenestration is as it pertains to the U factor. The thermal transmittance of the window is important. The solar heat gain coefficient is also very important. Now, within the CREEBC, you will find the various tables to demonstrate what the requirements are. They are the minimum standards. Minimum standards. So you can have a window or a door that is of a higher performance. But keep in mind that the requirements in the code are minimum. And the work that went into coming up with the requirements as far as the air leakage and other requirements, this came from decades of experience, work from experts in the fields and what they have seen for many, many, many years. And as well, as we said before, within the region, we also were able to examine the climate conditions in the region and see the areas that we could now maximize on getting the envelope to be more of a high performance envelope. So the figures were not just pulled from the sky, but it really is the result of a lot of work by experts internationally and as well throughout the region. Now, when it comes to natural ventilation, the residential provisions would take into consideration the size of windows and the location of windows, or the vertical fenestration. So this bedroom, bedroom number 2, is the center bedroom. Remember when I looked at this slide, I told you we'll be referencing this. So we're going to look at bedroom number 2 and the master bedroom number 3 to see what the requirements are as far as natural ventilation. The first thing to note is that the window must be at least 40% of the floor area, 14%, 14% of the floor area of the conditioned space. So in selecting the window, you must get a window that is sized to meet that requirement, at least 14% of the floor area of that room, because it's the only exposed wall. So you want to maximize on the possibility of having some natural ventilation. The second thing to note is that the doors must be able to be left open so that you have some cross ventilation. So this is for a middle bedroom. The end room, the opposite walls must have windows. And there were no specifications or no requirements for the size of the windows because the 2 opposite walls must have windows. The specification for size is only when you have 1 exterior wall. And for both the end room and the middle room, the door must be able to be kept in the open position. So this door leads to the master bedroom here, and as well, this one leads to the middle bedroom for natural ventilation. Now, after you've selected your compliance path, then you would now, for the simplified semi-condition compliance path, the only mandatory requirement would be air leakage requirements. And the air leakage requirements looks at the windows to ensure that the windows are not leaky. And I went through the specification for the windows. We also have to consider that the walls, floors, and ceilings separating conditioned and unconditioned spaces are properly sealed. And this is the red line here. So the bedrooms are here, and that's the only conditioned space within the residential building. The wall separating conditioned space from unconditioned space must be sealed. So you have to demonstrate in your construction, not just on the documents, but in your construction of that new home, that you are actually sealing that the conditioned sections compared to the unconditioned sections of the building are sealed. And this is the only mandatory requirement when using the simplified approach. So I'm saying that to say that in terms of residential buildings, we should see a great uptake of the usage of the code within the construction of residential buildings. The other area that is necessary when it comes to the following the requirements of the code is lighting and fan requirements. For the lighting requirements, at least 90% of the installed lighting systems must be 90% efficacy. In chapter 2 of the code, the definition of high efficacy lamps is as stated here. So as you design your building, you will determine the wattage of the various lamps. And based on the wattage, there is a corresponding lumen for that lamp. So for example, if you're going to be using lamps that are over 40 watts, the lumens should be 60 lumens per watt. If you're using lamps that are over 5 watts, up to 40 watts, you should have 50 lumens per watt. And if it is between 15 watts or less, then it is 40 lumens per watt. This is the definition in chapter 2. And so for residential buildings, it's very important. It is a very key requirement that your lamps, at least 90% of your lamps, are high efficacy lamps, LED lamps or the T8 lamps the rating. So you need to find out from the supplier the efficacy of the lamps that you're purchasing. And that's being efficient. That's being able to get the amount of light, or more lighting in some cases, with less energy. Then we move to the roof, which is part of the building envelope. The roof is a very, very important component of our buildings. And what we are seeking to do is to have an efficient roof that has the ability to reflect that heat away from the building and reduce the amount of heat absorbed through the roof, because this would help to reduce, again, the impact on the cooling systems. So if a high performance roof would be able to block off majority of the sunlight and protect the interior of the building from being overheated. So roofs with either a high albedo roof with the thermal resistance of R2.3 insulation. So all of the requirements you see here, you would have to demonstrate that to the code official if you're using if you have adopted the code as a national code. But if you've done it as a national standard, then you would demonstrate the insulation values that you'll be using. So you'll be working with the National Bureau of Standards to say that my building, I utilize the code for my building. And of course, you can get quite a bit of PR if it is being used as that. And there are other incentives, again, that can be derived from utilizing the code. In the absence of a high albedo roof with the resistance of 2.3, we now have the resistance, the R value for insulation of that roof at 3.3. So you see an increase in the insulation if it is not a high albedo roof. So provisions for the roof, I mean, some of the architects will say to you that even the color of the roof, a white roof or light colored roof would attract less heat than a black roof. And we see more and more construction in the region where people are beginning to use dark gray colors for roofs. And if that's the case, then you need to increase the insulation of that roof and ensure that it is a cool roof. Now, for residential and commercial buildings, this requirement, the minimum roof reflectance and the emittance options, you will see that it is found in section C402.3 of the code. And what it speaks to is that there is a 3-year age solar reflectance index of 55 and a 3-year age thermal emittance of 0.75. This is what you need to be able to get from the suppliers to demonstrate that you are meeting the requirements of the code. So once again, suppliers must be in tune with what's going on, and the products that are being made available to us in the region should be able to meet the requirements or exceed the requirements of the code. In the absence of the reflective index of 0.55 and the thermal emittance of 0.75, you can use a 3-year age solar reflectance index of 64. Okay, so if you are not able to get the thermal emittance of 0.75, then the solar reflective index would be 64. And this is really what you're trying to accomplish, is to reflect as much of that heat away from the roof so that it does not enter the space. Any questions pertaining to the semi-condition compliance path? Do we have any questions, Mr. Sempre?
We do. We have about 15 questions. I don't think we could take all of them at this time, and they're not specific really to the semi-condition. Yeah. So
Okay.
Very early on, we have a question from David Clark. How are new energy efficient buildings differ from older efficient buildings?
Right, that's a good question. So the older efficient buildings, they emphasize a lot on the design. So you'll notice that, for example, the roof would be the high albedo roofs. And they would also include some degree of ventilation as well for the roofs in the older buildings. The newer buildings, the newer efficient buildings have incorporated the whole idea of controls. And that's a mandatory requirement of the code. The control systems having thermostats for the air conditioning units and not just any thermostat, but a programmable thermostat. So that's the key thing, is that you have the inclusion of technology, in particular control devices. And one of the reasons why we selected the 2018 version of the International Energy Code is because of the stringent measures, the number of control devices that are used to bring about the efficient use of energy in buildings.
Okay, thank you. Another question coming from Amid Ali. What about the use of blackout curtains or screens inside of the window? Will the code be satisfied by this undertaking?
It is an undertaking that will reduce the radiant heat entering the building. The code looks at the performance of the fenestration itself, but it does not give the requirements for blinds. It specifically looks at the windows and provides the minimum U factors for fenestration. And as I said, the U factor takes into consideration the thermal transmittance of a building component or assembly. So it really looks at the actual fenestration, and then you will not see in the code the requirements for blinds, but we understand that it will also assist in reducing the heat load into the buildings.
Okay. We also have one from David Clark asking how does a new building complies with new energy code, and how older buildings, both residential and commercial, are retrofitted to meet the new energy code?
Right.
I guess you could just answer the one for residential.
Right. So he was asking how can existing buildings?
Yes, I guess you're talking about retrofitting. Yeah.
Right. So there is a section I'll be going through in terms of existing buildings. So the retrofit should not bring about an increase in the energy use. In other words, if you're doing a project and you would like to use the code in an existing building, you can demonstrate, if you're doing an addition, that the addition is in compliance with the code, or you can also look at it as the addition plus the existing building to be brought in terms of into alignment with the requirements of the code. So there are three options you have if you're doing additions. There are also guidelines for repairs. The end result should be that you should not end up with an increase in the energy consumption, the annual energy consumption of that building. And if it is that you are, then you need to demonstrate that you are in compliance with the code.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Nawada. We'll take one final question in that session.
Sure.
Fabian Scott, we have a construction firm that is soon about to commence construction of residential houses, and inquired of us, when you speak of us, you're talking about the BNSI, the Bureau of Standards, how can they be given energy efficiency certification? This question relates to the verification system where local code officials themselves are not yet qualified to issue such verification. What course of action would you recommend to the NSB to offer in terms of support to such a client?
I didn't get a full question, but I think you were saying that a firm wants to use the code. What sort of guidance can the NSB provide to the firm to implement the code?
Yeah, taking in consideration that there is not a verification system at present, and those persons who would provide the verification are not so qualified to do so. So what course of action you would suggest the NSB give to support the use of the code, implementation of the code?
Right, so the NSB, if first of all, you've adopted the code as a national standard, it is a voluntary approach that you'll be taking, which is what I would recommend most member states to look at it as a phased implementation of the code, starting with adopting the code as a national standard. Now, if there are verification matters that would have to be implemented, you can now begin by using some of the information from the suppliers. So the manufacturer would have to give you the specifications. And so it would have to be based on the labels. The products would have to be provided with labels and specifications to demonstrate that they are meeting the requirements of the code. So in the absence of the able to verify it locally, then you would depend on the specifications from suppliers.
I would also like to add, Mr. Norbert, that the NSB can get an official certified. We did provide some certification courses for the code officials that would be working in verifying the compliance to the code. So I would suggest to the BNSI to ensure that at least they have one person on staff, or if it is through the planning unit, that the planning unit has somebody on staff certified, you understand, to verify the code compliance to the code. The ICC do offer courses, and like I said, we would have mentioned that we would have provided training to those code officials as certification program, right? So we would like to encourage BNSI to encourage the professionals, especially in the planning and at the BNSI itself, to do the certified training course for code officials. Thanks. At this point in time, what we will do, Norbert, we'll continue the presentation, and we will try to answer the balance of the questions later on in the webinar. And if we do not get around to all of them, we would certainly write the responses to the persons providing the questions. So I would like to invite you, Mr. Norbert, to continue with your presentation, and bearing in mind that we kind of limited on time. So taking that into consideration, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Fulgence. I'll try to be as efficient as I can with time. So let's just touch on the mandatory requirements, as I said. The mandatory requirements, particularly when you've used the simplified approach, the only mandatory requirement is the air leakage requirements. But this section, the table 2 checklist, mandatory requirements include things like air leakage. So you want to ensure that the building envelope is properly sealed. You want to ensure that the performance of the fenestration is intact based on the requirements of the code. When it comes to mechanical systems, we will be looking at things like insulation. We'll be looking at things like the R values for insulation for ducted systems, hot water distribution pipes, the efficacy of the ventilation fans, the use of dampers, because ventilation should be by mechanical means and not by a leaky building. Lighting as well is also mandatory, and we made mention of the efficacy for residential. So it's not as intense as commercial buildings. Residential buildings, the mandatory requirements would be that, as I said, it's listed here on the table. So we must be able to differentiate between prescriptive and mandatory requirements. Very important. Remember that the prescriptive items that shall be complied with only if the dwelling is complying with the prescriptive compliance path. If it is not complying with the prescriptive compliance path, then you would not be using the prescriptive requirements. The mandatory requirements, these are items that must be complied with for all compliance paths. That's the difference between mandatory and prescriptive. So let's keep that in mind as we go forward. This is the mandatory requirements checklist, and it gives you the relevant sections. Again, we are referring to the residential buildings. So as you utilize the code, sections with the prefix R refer to residential requirements, and the mandatory requirements are listed here. So you, the code user, would go through the requirements, as you can see, for air leakage, for fenestration air leakage, the testing of the residential building. And so as you move away from the simplified semi-conditioned compliance path and you get into buildings, residential buildings, for example, where the entire building is air conditioned, then you have to go for more stringent measures. So one of the new requirements is the whole question of testing the building to see how tight the envelope is. So you have to do the blower door test and the requirements in terms of the number of air changes. So you have the ACH, the requirement would be between 3 to 5 air changes per hour. The results of the blower door test should be such that you have the air change between 3 to 5 air change per hour to demonstrate that the building is not a leaky building. And the other requirements listed here would be all the mandatory requirements for duct testing, for sealing the the ducts, testing the ducts, and as well mechanical ventilation systems, the efficacy, as I said, of your fans. Because in a mechanical system, the fans use the most energy, especially in commercial buildings. And so the fans would be having to ventilate the building. The dampers would have to be able to be sealed when not in use. So you will have something like a CO2 sensor to trigger that fan when you want to increase or to ventilate the building. And dampers are used to seal the envelope when not in use. Similar as we saw, the certificate, if you're using the mandatory requirements, you will also include a certificate, which would basically have the energy efficiency measures of the building. It's a quick way of verifying if what you've used in the building as far as energy efficiency is concerned, based on the requirements of the CREEBC. Now, air leakage and the building envelope, the building thermal envelope, air leakage occurs when outside air enters and conditioned air leaves your house uncontrollably through cracks and openings. This is a very common thing in our region. As a matter of fact, most of our buildings, what appears to be the norm is that the buildings are ventilated because of air leakage. And ventilation should be intentional, not through leakage. It's unwise to rely on air leakage for ventilation, and it contributes to moisture problems that can affect occupants' health and structures' durability. So a tight envelope, if you're utilizing the code for your residential building, the code promotes having a very tight envelope, and ventilation would be by design, intentional. So the building thermal envelope, this is the image on the right, gives you an idea of what the building envelope is, and all what is highlighted in red, you would have to demonstrate the requirements in terms of the R values, the U factors of the solar heat gain coefficient of the building thermal envelope. What the code seeks to do is to ensure that the building is tight, number one, and number two, that the thermal resistance of the walls, the ceiling, the floors, and as well the thermal transmittance of the fenestration is tight. In essence, the conditioned space should not be affected by the hot temperatures on the outside. And the requirements for the envelope, the thermal envelope, are the minimum requirements, so that when you design your cooling system, it will not be, the outside hot temperatures would not be able to penetrate the building as it would be where the envelope is not efficient. So air sealing, this is just a partial table from the code, and it really gives you the components, how you establish the air barrier, how it should be installed. It should be continuous. There should be no gaps between the air barrier for obvious reasons. And the insulation installation criteria. So there were the requirements listed in various tables in the code for your project, whether you're looking at the mandatory requirements or a particular compliance path. This image again just demonstrates the construction in the region, paying attention to the sealing of, for example, this area down here should be properly sealed. So you're looking at ensuring that your envelope is properly sealed to keep it as tight as possible, so that you will have an envelope that is very efficient and not leaky. Penetrations, where you have the air conditioning units installed, to ensure that areas that would normally be forgotten, attention will be paid to seal these areas properly and not depend on leaks through the envelope to ventilate the building. Another example here, as far as the duct penetration, the duct penetrations must be properly sealed. And you can see an example on the left that is not code compliant, and the example on the right where the duct is properly sealed, separating the ceiling or the attic from the conditioned space. So around the duct, you can notice that there's some sealant to prevent air leakage through between the duct and the ceiling. Critical is the use of recessed lighting. The code has provisions for using the IC rated recessed lighting. IC rated means it's the insulation contact rated, where the canister, it's double canned. So the recessed light is double canned, meaning that you can now have the recessed light in contact with the dry wall. There is no need to have a gap of about 3 inches between the recessed light and the dry wall. If it is not IC rated, then you have to leave a gap between. But the code references the IC rated recessed lighting to reduce the amount of air leakage between the recessed light and the attic, because a significant amount of air could be leaking through the recessed light, affecting the performance of your cooling system. So there are requirements for recessed lighting as far as sealing the envelope to separate conditioned space from unconditioned space. Programmable thermostats are recommended, and it's not just any thermostat. The thermostat must be able to be programmed to suit the 7-day schedule. And this is one of the stringent measures in the code that allows you to maximize the efficiency as far as not having the units turned on when the space is not occupied. Duct sealing. The ducts, air handlers, and the filter boxes must be sealed. The joints and seals must comply with the International Mechanical Code or the International Residential Code. So the code references other standards and other codes as well. And so no code really stands alone. There are references to other codes and other standards. So for example, the duct, if you have a highly and a very efficient cooling system, but your ducts are not sealed properly, you can be losing conditioned air through the joints. So you see that the requirements so far are targeting the hot spots, the energy hot spots in buildings where normally a significant amount of wastage would take place in these areas. And the duct has to be tested as well, based on the testing, how it should be tested. The code provides you with this information. So these are mandatory requirements if you are using the prescriptive compliance options or the simulating performance options for your buildings to demonstrate code compliance. Mechanical ventilation, very, very, very important. It is a mandatory requirement, and there are requirements, as I said, for the fans, the number of air changes, and how buildings are ventilated, referencing other international codes. So there are a suite of codes and standards that the CREEBC references to bring to you the best available out there, best practices to see after the energy efficiency of your buildings, and of course, the safety of the occupants. So if you're doing a whole house mechanical ventilation, you have to consider the efficacy of the fans, and the efficacy of the fans depending on the location of the fan. So this table R4 3.6.1 would now provide you with the different locations, what the airflow rate, the minimum airflow rate should be, and as well the minimum efficacy in liters per watts per second, which is the SI units, and the imperial units would be CFM per watt. So you would use this as your guide to meet the requirements of the code when ventilating your residential building. Now, very important, the whole question of load calculations. When you are sizing equipment, cooling systems, the load calculations are very important. You must take into consideration the internal loads, heat loads, and the external heat loads. Internal would be, as you see on the left, your lights, machines that are inside the building, the people, how many people in the building, and use this to calculate internal loads, plus the conduction, convection, infiltration, and as well radiation. So in designing your residential building, to right size the equipment and not to have equipment, oversized equipment that will use more energy, or equipment that are undersized so that they are not cooling effectively, the code requires that you reference the calculations are done in accordance with the ACCA Manual S based on the load calculated in accordance with the ACCA Manual J. for your residential. And that's if you are now designing a building that is going to be more than 50% air conditioned. So you have to get into more details as far as load calculations and more stringent measures for mechanical systems. So as I said, the rule of thumb method does not work. And so you have to do actual calculations, taking into consideration the internal loads and external loads to right size the equipment. It may seem as a very trivial matter, but in many instances, when you enter buildings, there are people with sweaters on, meaning that you are wasting energy, overcooling the building, and that the same work could be done with a smaller unit. So the code provides you with the guidelines to, or the requirements as far as how the equipment should be sized based on calculations. The pool requirements. So if your residential building has a pool and that pool is heated, the heater must have a readily accessible switch to turn it on and off. That's a safety feature. It must be equipped with a time switch as well to automatically turn it off. Heated pools must be covered. But if the heated pool is supplied by a renewable energy source, then there's no need to cover it. When it comes to the pumps and the controls for the pumps, there must be a minimum. The pump must be able to operate at a minimum of 2 speeds or more. The speed is directly proportional to the energy usage. So when you reduce the speed of the pump, meaning that you need a lower turnover of that pump, you're actually saving energy. The implications of not doing that, using a conventional pump, would be that you are using maximum energy all the time when it's not necessary. And the controls as well should be able to control at least 2 speeds or more. The mechanical systems, the code makes provisions for insulation. As you can see on the bottom right, the mechanical piping located in unconditioned spaces and conveying fluids that are greater than 41 degrees Celsius or less than 31 degrees Celsius must be insulated to R0.5. This is an example of the requirements for mechanical systems as it comes to insulation, the R value, the thermal resistance of that insulation for mechanical systems. So we'll continue to the next area that looks at the prescriptive. Once again, your project, the first thing that you would do with your project team is to decide the compliance path. I made mention of the simplified one that most of our residential buildings in the region could utilize. Now we're going to talk about a little bit more of the prescriptive compliance path, which is a bit more involved. So there are 3 prescriptive compliance options. The simplified one is what is referred to as the R value, and there is a table 3 checklist to explain that. So this table 3 is the simplified prescriptive checklist. If you are demonstrating that your project is in compliance with the code, then you would now follow through the various requirements for your ceiling, your mass above grade walls, fenestration, skylights, the duct insulation, duct testing, and include this information as far as what the code requires and what you are recommending or you have included in your design. So you submit this to the code officials along with your construction documents to demonstrate that you're in compliance. The code official must know that you're using the prescriptive compliance path. You have to let them know that. And then they would know that, okay, they would be able to look for the requirements in your construction documents and during the inspection process. So the mass walls, examples of mass walls would be concrete block, the concrete walls, insulated concrete foam or masonry cavity, the brick adobe, compressed earth block, rammed earth, solid timber or solid log, or any wall having a heat capacity of 123 kilojoules per square meter per degree Kelvin or higher. This would mean that it is a mass wall. So you have to be able to differentiate mass walls from regular walls, and then the different examples given there for mass walls. This is important because as you utilize the code, you will notice that the code references above grade walls that are mass walls, as you can see here, and what the required U factors and the thermal resistance of that wall is, which will be different to the mass wall. Below grade walls will be a different value. So you have to pay attention to whether it's an above grade wall or below grade wall. The requirements for floors, requirements for fenestration as well. And so the table R402.1.2 would provide you with the insulation and the fenestration criteria. You would utilize this to demonstrate compliance with the code. So as we continue, again, if you have a steel frame ceiling, wall, and floor, the recommended insulation values, the R values for steel frame, and this would be for wooden and concrete buildings, for steel frame buildings, residential buildings, the corresponding thermal resistance for your ceiling, walls, and the floors. Insulation and fenestration criteria, depending on your climate zone and the respective tables. So as you utilize the code, most of our Caribbean countries are within climate zone 0, meaning that there are over 6,000 cooling degree days at 10 degrees C. And so the climate zone 0 would help you to determine the fenestration requirements as per the table listed here. What are the U factors depending on your climate zone? Fenestration U factor and the solar heat gain coefficient. Let me just repeat, this is an example of a label that would be included to demonstrate to the code officials that you're meeting the requirements. In the absence of the table or the label, the manufacturer would have to provide you with the specifications. Understanding what the fenestration U factors and the solar heat gain requirements are for your residential building. And when you are using this, you would now have to demonstrate to the code officials that you have met the requirements. So there's nothing to guess. All of the information is there. Once you've selected your compliance path, then you would know what to do in terms of the requirements, and you demonstrate that you have met the requirements. This slide speaks to the ducts that are outside the building envelope. What is the thermal resistance as far as the insulation? And the insulation must be properly placed on the equipment to ensure that you are achieving the objective of not wasting energy when transfer air is being moved from the air handler to the various zones. This demonstrates the envelope in red, and that the air handler, the distribution and return lines are all within the thermal envelope of the building. The code makes reference to things like that to ensure that your air handlers and your ducts are within the thermal envelope. And if it is that the ducts will be going outside of the thermal envelope of the building, the requirement as far as the insulation levels that should be complied with. Hot water distribution pipes, the insulation as well. This is all part of the prescriptive requirements. And so a minimum of R0.05 would be the minimum thermal resistance for insulation for hot water pipes. So we're now looking at the third section as far as compliance options. We've discussed the simplified, which is what most residential buildings in the region can utilize. Outside of that, you can look at the prescriptive, and within the prescriptive, the three options here. The most simplified one is the R value, and you follow the requirements for the R value as far as the prescriptive requirements. Now we'll talk about the simulated performance alternative, which is part of the alternative performance paths. This is where you can utilize software to demonstrate compliance for your residential project. And the software would have to be approved locally within your respective jurisdiction. To demonstrate, all you're seeking to do now is to compare the design, which is the code requirements, to your proposed design. So as you see here, this table R405.5.21 is actually a table within the code. And as you utilize the code, any area or section of the code where you see the double vertical lines, it means that the project team, the regional team, made changes. It's specific to us in the region. So as you utilize the code within the residential or commercial sections, there are changes made to make it a Caribbean application document. So this is specific to us in the region. So as we used the 2018 International Conservation Code, the changes that you will see in the code, you will notice that there are double vertical lines next to it. So this is part of what we did as a project team to make it specific to us in the region. So for this approach, you use software and use the standard reference design compared to your proposed design. And at the end of the day, the annual energy cost must be equal to the annual energy cost of the proposed design, of the standard design compared to your proposed design. So if the annual energy cost is the same or less, then your design would meet the code requirements and be approved by the code officials. This is just an example to show you how you compare the annual energy cost based on the standard design and your proposed design. So you have to be lower than the proposed. So in this instance, this application would meet the requirements of the code. And when using the simulated performance option, the whole question of maximum solar heat gain coefficient, the area weighted average for maximum fenestration, there are trade-offs that are allowed in section R405 when using. So depending on the compliance path for your residential building, then you would be able to know what you should include in your design. This is an example to show the air exchange rate and the whole question of the blower door. This is an opportunity here for most of our experts in the energy industry to include this as another feature, another service that you offer, where you could now test buildings to realize how leaky or how tight the building is. And the final compliance option would be using what's known as the Energy Rating Index. The Energy Rating Index, or the ERI, again, utilizing software. So we have the Residential Energy Services Network, ResNet. They were the ones who developed HERS, which is the Home Energy Rating Systems for residential buildings. And this software, you would demonstrate what the Energy Rating Index of your proposed design is as compared to the standard design. And for us in the region, the Energy Rating Index, to demonstrate that your application or your project meets the requirements of the code, is 57. And so software could be utilized to demonstrate compliance. Just note that the mandatory requirements for the prescriptive and the simulated or energy rating index, you must meet all of the mandatory requirements. You also may have a case where you're using other above code programs like LEED. LEED programs can be used to demonstrate compliance, but you must include the mandatory requirements in your design. So for the final area we're going to be talking about would be existing buildings. As I said, there are three options for additions, where you treat the addition as a standalone and demonstrate compliance for the standalone, or demonstrate compliance for the entire house, the existing plus the addition. The third option for additions would be existing house, or demonstrate that the house plus the addition uses no more energy than the original house for additions within an existing building. In section R305, there are provisions for alterations to existing buildings. For most of us, if you would like to do an energy project and incorporate the requirements of the code in your residential building, then you look at the additions or alterations and be guided by the requirements here. It would provide you with all the information in section R305. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through it, but bear in mind that you can now utilize the code in an existing building following the requirements within the residential section, and as well for repairs. Change in occupancy or change in use should just not increase the energy consumption of that building. And lastly, I just want to review a case study that was done in a building here in Antigua, where we actually looked at fenestration upgrades as the option. This was the energy efficiency measure for that building, improving the performance as far as improving the U factors, improving the solar heat gain coefficient of the building. So the red screen expert was used for this case study. And what we saw is that in addition to the fenestration upgrades, the leakage, the building was made tighter, so the envelope was made tighter, especially windows and doors. So move from medium to tight. So making the envelope tighter, upgrading the fenestration, resulted in a 61% energy savings, depending on the cooling loads. So where your cooling loads would have been this figure here, after the modeling of the building to make it tighter and upgrading the fenestration, we saw a reduction of 159,134 kilowatt hours. And in this example, we see that the energy efficiency projects compared to the renewable energy projects, the CO2 avoided and the payback period. The payback period for the energy efficiency was less than 2 years, whereas the payback period for the 48 kilowatt rooftop system was 11, almost 12 years for the payback. So energy efficiency projects in buildings would yield very good results as far as the payback period, and the economic value for energy projects are much higher than the renewable energy in buildings. And this is a case study here in Antigua. We also looked at the project, the ESD project, the Energy for Sustainable Development in Caribbean Buildings. And by the way, this was part of my thesis in terms of analyzing the relevance of energy efficiency measures and renewable energy measures in buildings. And you can see the difference here. And this is the final slide that looks at benefits from using the energy efficiency measures compared to renewable energy measures. And the payback period for energy efficiency was 1.7 years, under 2 years again, as compared to the renewable energy project. And that was a 9.5 kilowatt ground mount PV system at the Environment Department. The payback period was 9.5 years. So I'm just sharing this with you so you can appreciate the benefits to be derived from energy efficiency projects. We recommend that you do the energy efficiency projects first, then you incorporate the renewable energy projects. And in the code, there is a section, the final section of the code, residential and commercial, looks at the solar ready zone. So you make provisions on your rooftop for future rooftop systems. So I will end here in terms of providing you a snapshot of what is it within the residential requirements for our codes, and to encourage you. As I looked at the statistics from the polls, I'm happy to see that over 70% of you are aware of the code. But what we need to see now is the uptake, the usage of the code throughout the CARICOM region. So thank you for listening to me, and I do await any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Nowat. We do have plenty of questions in the chat. However, we will not be able to take all of them. I think for now, we will see if we could address 3, because I have 1 or 2 questions that I would like to pose to you, right? So we'll take these questions, and then we will look at the 3 questions that I have for you to respond to. Anonymous attendee says, does the code consider quality and use of construction materials that support natural cooling, lighting, and energy efficiency?
Yes. When I started my presentation looking at the simplified semi-conditioned compliance option, you notice that we made provisions for ventilation. And that, for example, if you have a 3-bedroom house, the middle bedroom, the window should be at least 14% of the floor area. This is to promote natural ventilation in residential buildings. And as well, the end room should have windows on the opposite walls, and the door should be able to be kept open as well.
Okay. Jamal Francis question, is there a chart for efficacy of LED and CFL lamps? I assume the 40-watt lamp you referred to in your presentation was an incandescent lamp?
No, the 40-watt is all what I referred to as far as high efficacy are LED lamps. The LED lamps, light emitting diodes.
Right. And the final question we'll take here is from Ian Weeks. In providing for a high-performance envelope to comply with the fenestration air leakage standard, is there provision for filtered and measured outdoor air dilution and exhaust ventilation into spaces such as bedrooms and rooms with mini-split unit to ensure occupant comfort and good indoor air quality? Are there plans to consider this for residences as an adjunct to this standard?
Yes, there are always consideration to improve. This code goes through a 6-year cycle, so it will be updated in I think it's 2024.
2024, yeah.
Yes, but as far as the indoor air quality, this is a very key safety feature of the code. Noting that the code does not abridge, if there are any existing health and safety standards, the code does not abridge any existing standards for buildings. For example, if you have a building code with health and safety standards, the code does not abridge that. And secondly, when we speak about mechanical systems, the code looks at ventilation as well, where the mechanical systems are responsible for ventilation in the buildings and not depending on leakage through the envelope for ventilation. So yes, there are benefits to be derived as far as having buildings that are properly ventilated by design. That is intentional.
Thank you, Chair. My question to you: what are the main benefits, right, to be derived from the use of the CREEBC in the residential sector of CARICOM region?
So the main benefits, I would keep in mind the address by Mr. Jordan when he spoke about the 5 Ps. So the 5 Ps he spoke about: people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. The main benefits would be centered around that, because the code is centered around people and the planet and all what he spoke about. When we look at the benefits from the code in terms of reducing the building energy use, converting wastage into profits, supporting resiliency, and as well the life safety aspects, as we spoke about ventilation just moments ago. So I would summarize this to say that the main benefits would be socioeconomic benefits and as well environmental benefits for the building sector. Now, a lot of our Caribbean member states are in the process of updating the nationally determined contributions. And I've already seen mention being made about the use of the code in the updated NDCs, so that member states will be able to demonstrate that they are in compliance with the code, and they have already developed a roadmap for decarbonizing the energy sector by 2050. So tremendous benefits that could be summarized as socioeconomic benefits and environmental benefits.
Thank you. In your estimation, do we have the institutional framework within the member states of CARICOM to support the implementation of the CREEBC?
I would say a resounding yes. We do have the institutional framework to support the implementation. One of the areas that I would like to mention is that apart from the code, we have seen in the CARICOM region where buildings are using LEED programs. And I just received an email from my colleague, the architect who actually designed and constructed our very first LEED Gold certified building in Antigua and Barbuda. It's an interpretation center in a protected area. And so we have demonstrated throughout the region that we can implement these above code programs, such as LEED. And a few other Caribbean islands, St. Lucia, Barbados, I think Trinidad and Jamaica, we have also demonstrated how we can, even LEED is even an above code program. So if we can implement programs such as LEED, I'm confident that we can implement the CREEBC as well.
Thanks for this answer. My final question to you, and I think that would give Fabian some information as pertaining to his questions before. What are your recommendations for anyone who intends to use the CREEBC for residential project?
Okay, so this question really, my response would be, first of all, to refer to the NBS, the National Bureau of Standards. They are the custodians of the code. They will be able to guide you as far as, first of all, getting a copy of the code and to provide you with some of the technical expertise. You know, we have mirror committees and there are personnel who have been trained throughout the region through CROSSQ and the partnerships with ICC. And they will be able to refer you to the experts who will be able to assist you in implementing the codes in your project. So the first stop should be the National Bureau of Standards throughout the 15 member states of CARICOM, and they would provide the guidance as far as access to some of our experts in the region who were part of the development of this Caribbean application document. So they'll refer you to the experts, and as well the information from getting the access to the code, so you have your personal copy of the code to utilize it. So I would recommend that they would go to the National Bureau of Standards office, and they have the pool of resources that will help you to successfully implement the code.
Thank you, Mr. Norbert. At this point in time, like I would have indicated before, we really cannot take on all the myriad of questions that we have in the question and answer. But rest assured that all your questions would be responded to during the course of this week. I would have also mentioned the fact that we would do another poll. So can I request that that poll be put up?
And in addition to that, Fulgence, after the poll, perhaps we can take another few questions if the audience is willing to stay with us until midday. That's in another 7 to 8 minutes. We can perhaps take a few questions up until then because we still have quite a few outstanding. And if we might begin with Mr. Scott, I think he has something else to add as well.
Yeah, he has his hands raised up because he didn't type the question. So maybe we'll give him access to the mic. Okay, thanks. Right, so these are the questions, the poll questions. Take 2 minutes to respond. Thank you. Laika, you could show us the results. Right. So we have, what would you see is more dominant in the built environment in your country? Residential properties or commercial properties? 79% would have said residential. For which reason would you most likely use energy efficient measures in your home? You have a series of choices here, but the top choice was cost saving. So cost saving is a major factor for persons implementing energy measures. And the final question is, do you plan to utilize a residential code when locating, I was trying to scroll up. Like, I'm not seeing the rest of the question there.
Can I just help you?
Yeah.
Do you plan to utilize the residential codes when looking to make upgrades or improvements in your home? And we have a resounding 88% saying yes. No one said no. And undecided 12%.
Okay, that's it. Thanks for that. So at this point in time, as Latoya already indicated, Fabian, I think you had your hand up for quite a while. You wanted to have a follow-up question to explain your first question. Yeah, could we give Fabian access to his mic, please? Go ahead, Fabian.
So thanks, CrossQ, great town hall. I think this is lovely, very good initiative. I'll be very brief. It's not a new question. It's just a follow-up on the initial question about the verification of residential energy efficient homes. So as the presenter said, Mr. Norbert, in Antigua, he has a LEED certified building, right? So that is it. I think our clients, which are the construction firms, want the visibility or want the award to either use that to leverage clients to buy homes from them or to sell their services to commercial entities to say, look, we can design and build for you an energy efficient building. So I think they can read the code, they can interpret the code. That's not the challenge here. They can design energy efficient residential homes and commercial buildings. They want visibility. They want everyone to know that they're designing these buildings. And so therefore, someone needs to verify that that building meets code or meets a LEED requirement or whatever. So that's the challenge that we have. And I want to know, since our code officials in most countries haven't yet set the exam and qualified themselves, how then can we satisfy these clients to use the code, to get them to use it, to get the verification they want, so that they continue to build and design buildings like this. I'm a bit lost because without the code officials being qualified, I'm not sure how else we go about giving them what they want.
Fabian, if I may say before Norbert comes in, in terms of certification, right? There's always the option of self-certification, right? Once they would have abided with the requirements of the code, they can self-certify, right? That their code was built in compliance with the CREEBC. And I'm sure to verify that, should the BNSI want to verify, I'm sure the BNSI could identify someone, a professional within their community that could carry out a few checks to ensure that that certification is in compliance with the code. So there is self-certification, right? That can happen, okay, in the absence of not having a third-party certification. And so they can use that in the interim. And as we build the resource to verify compliance, I'm sure that the BNSI could engage someone with the necessary competence to verify that certification. I think that's the very first step. Norbert, over to you.
Yes, and thanks for adding this, Fulgence. As we are reminded that this is our first time having an energy efficiency building code, so there are steps to be taken as far as the best approach. The LEED programs have the ways of verifying. Data has to be sent to a central office, and so they will be able to verify that you've met the requirements. For this code now, we have to depend on the expertise within our respective jurisdictions. The engineers who are part of the development process, who are very familiar with it, can lend assistance as well. Those who have been certified by the ICC. So there are avenues to be certified through CrossQ, and engineers associations within the respective jurisdictions, the ministries of energy. So new relationships, as I said, would have to be built where we would pool our resources to learn the way forward. We can learn from some of our international partners, how it's done overseas. But to just emphasize on the point that Mr. Sempre made, it is for us to, first of all, piggyback on the professionals that exist within each member state, do some self-certifications. As we continue the process, then we can include our other professionals who have been trained, who are belonging to associations, engineers associations, a contractors association, and have that dialogue, because we do not have all the answers right now. but we can point in the direction that we should go in order to be able to meet that requirement. But it's a very good question from you, Mr. Scott. But it's a dialogue that should be continued within each respective jurisdiction to find out the best way of verifying that you are in compliance.
Thank you, Mr. Norbert. And Mr. Scott, Fabian, I hope that satisfies you to a certain extent. But you could always engage us further after the webinar if there are other solutions you look into. Okay, at this point in time, I'd like to thank everyone. Thank you tremendously, Mr. Norbert, for your presentation, for the participants. And I call on Ms. Latoya Burnham, the quality promotions officer at the CREEBC, to give us closing remarks. Ms. Burnham.
Thank you very much, Fulgence. I would like to first say thank you to Mr. Norbert, Churchill Norbert, always very, very efficient in terms of explaining the code and breaking it down for persons. I know there would have been quite a few questions that we did not get to today, but I just want to invite you really to go to our YouTube page, CARICOM Regional Organization for Standards and Quality. We will post questions and responses there. We will also post questions and responses that we did not get to on our energy page, energy.crossq.org, energy.crossq.org. So if you asked a question today or you saw questions that you're interested in seeing the responses to, just look out to those two spaces. When we actually post the questions, we will notify you via our social media, our Facebook or LinkedIn page. So you can watch those spaces as well to see the updates in relation to when those questions and answers are actually posted. But I want to say thank you very much to the TAPSEC for having sponsored this series. Tomorrow and Thursday, we will also have 2 additional sessions. We will have a session on the commercial applications tomorrow, and then the ASHRAE compliance on Thursday. So we invite you as well to join us for those sessions if you haven't already registered. There are very few spaces left, so head on over to our Facebook and look for the link to register for those sessions. But thank you very much, everyone, for having been here. Thank you to the energy team behind the scenes, Mr. Fulgence Saint-Prix, who, as usual, is knowledgeable because he's led the process as our technical officer for standards development within the CREEBC network. And thank you, the participants, really for the interest. We almost ran out of spaces today for this session, but we thank you very much for your interest. We know it's lunchtime now and you want to get to eat, but we hope to see some of you tomorrow and for Thursday for the follow-up sessions. Thank you, everyone, for the effort today. And I think we would have all been very, very well educated over the past 2 hours with the session that was led by Mr. Norbert. So have a good day and we will see you soon. Bye.
Thank you, Latoya. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for attending. And like Latoya would say, please join us tomorrow and Thursday for the balance of the town hall meeting, a snapshot of the CREEBC. Bye, everyone.
The CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code was developed to help property developers increase the energy efficiency and the upgradability of their building projects. Energy savings help offset the potential higher cost of building your home to code. And enhanced upgradability helps commercial owners increase their competitive advantage, saving money over time. Additionally, lower energy demands during and after the building process can also lead to community and national level benefits like reduced reliance on fossil fuel generated electricity across the construction industry and in homes, lower national fuel import bills, which can free up funding for other critical areas of investment, and fewer greenhouse gas emissions. So do the maths, play the long game, and help build towards a better future today. For For more information on the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code, visit energy.crosq.org.